There is a funny little moment in every neighborhood war when everybody realizes the loudest person in the room was never actually in charge. And in my case, that moment started with two sheriff's deputies, one moving truck, and a woman in a pearl necklace calling me an armed trespasser while I was carrying my grandfather's rocking chair into my own cabin. I wish I could tell you I handled it with some kind of movie star confidence, like I leaned against the porch rail and delivered the perfect line. But the truth is, I was sweaty, tired, covered in dust from a U-Haul, and holding one end of a chair that smelled like cedar smoke and old pipe tobacco. And standing behind the deputies, parked in a silver Mercedes SUV like she was supervising a crime scene, was Marla Voss, president of the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association, a woman who had apparently decided that my family history was a violation of community standards. My name is Caleb Whitmore, and the cabin sits on the north bend of Willowglass Lake, tucked into the foothills outside Ellijay, Georgia, where the roads curl through pine and red clay, and every hill looks like it is hiding somebody's secret. My grandfather, Elias Whitmore, bought that land in 1966, 170 acres nobody wanted back then because it was steep, rocky, and too far from town for anyone with sense, which should tell you something about my grandfather because he saw that place and thought, perfect. Elias had been a county surveyor for 30 years, the kind of man who could look at a creek bed, a ridge line, and a faded plat map and tell you exactly where money would be in 50 years. Not that he cared much about money, he just cared about land, staying land. In 1977, he built the cabin with his brother Ray and a brick mason named Amos Pike, white oak beams, a stone fireplace, a porch that wrapped halfway around the front, and a tin roof that sounded like applause when it rained. That cabin was where my father taught me how to clean a fish, where my mother used to fall asleep in a porch swing with a paperback over her face, where my little sister broke her ankle jumping off the dock because I dared her to, which she still brings up every Thanksgiving like I personally invented gravity. It was not fancy, but it was ours, and in my family that meant more than fancy ever could. Then in 1986, a developer named Russell Kane came to Elias with a plan. He wanted to build a lake community on the flatter stretch near the county road. 60 houses, paved lanes, a small clubhouse, walking trails, the whole dream wrapped in pine trees and weekend mortgages. Russell wanted to buy the land outright, but my grandfather would not sell it. He agreed to lease 28 acres for 48 years, with renewal options, and he kept the deed. The lakefront, the access roads, the ridgeline, the utility easements, and every strip of land not specifically included in that lease. It was all written down, recorded at the county office, signed, stamped, and filed away where any responsible person could have found it with 10 minutes and a clerk who knew which cabinet scraped. Cedar Hollow was built, families moved in, an HOA was created, rules were written, fences went up, azaleas were planted, and over the years people started talking about the lake and the trails and the roads like they had always belonged to the association. My grandfather never corrected people unless he had to. He was not a man who enjoyed power. He was a man who enjoyed quiet, and if folks wanted to walk down to the water with their kids or put a canoe in at sunset, he let them. He figured being a good neighbor did not require a committee. When he passed, the land went to my father, and when my father died too young, it eventually came to me. I kept the tax bills paid, kept the records in a fireproof box, and for a few years, I mostly stayed away because life had gotten heavy in that way life does when it stacks grief, divorce, and work all on the same shelf and waits for the shelf to crack. By the spring of that year, I was 39, newly remote, freshly tired of Atlanta traffic, and just stubborn enough to believe starting over in my grandfather's cabin might save whatever was left of me. So I loaded the U-Haul, drove north, turned onto the old gravel road, and for the first time in years, felt like I could breathe. The road was rougher than I remembered, branches scraping the top of the truck, gravel popping under the tires. But when the cabin came into view, sitting there in the morning light with the lake behind it, I had to stop for a second. It looked smaller than it had when I was a kid, but somehow stronger too, like it had been waiting without making a big deal about it. I just lowered the ramp and started unloading when I heard engines behind me. 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled down the access road, lights flashing but no sirens, which is a special kind of humiliating because it makes the whole thing feel official and ridiculous at the same time. A deputy named Harlan stepped out first, hand near his belt, polite but cautious. and asked me to step away from the house. Behind him came another deputy, younger, nervous, looking at my moving boxes like one of them might jump. Then I saw the Mercedes. Marla Voss sat inside, sunglasses on, lips tight, hands folded over a clipboard against the steering wheel. Deputy Harlan said they had received a 911 call about a suspicious man breaking into a vacant structure, possibly armed. I looked down at the rocking chair in my hands and said, "Unless walnut furniture counts, I think we are safe." He did not laugh, but one corner of his mouth tried to. I gave him my license, my deed, the tax receipt, and a letter from my attorney that I had brought because my sister, who is smarter than me and meaner when she needs to be, told me not to walk onto inherited land without paper in reach. Harlan read everything, looked at the cabin, looked back at Marla's SUV and said, "Mr. Whitmore, as far as I can tell, you are exactly where you have a right to be." When the deputies left, Marla finally got out. She was in pressed white jeans and a navy blouse, with a Cedar Hollow badge hanging from a lanyard like she had been elected governor of a cul-de-sac. She did not apologize. She did not ask my name. She just looked at my truck, my boxes, my grandfather's chair, and said, "This lakefront structure falls inside a protected Cedar Hollow community zone, and occupancy requires board approval." I remember wiping my hands on my jeans and staring at her for a long second because there are moments when your brain refuses to process nonsense quickly. Then I said, "This is my cabin on my land, and I do not need board approval to sleep in the house my grandfather built." Marla smiled, not warmly, more like she had just found a typo she could punish, and said, "We will let the documents decide that." Then she got back in her Mercedes and drove away, slow enough for me to understand she wanted the last word. 6 days later, I got my first violation notice. The HOA accused me of unauthorized occupancy, non-conforming roof material, unapproved exterior appearance, improper vehicle storage, and failure to submit an architectural review packet. They fined me $400, with $200 added every week until compliance. I sat on the porch reading it while a heron walked the shallows like he was minding his own business better than anyone in Cedar Hollow knew how to. 2 weeks after that, a lawyer named Preston Hale sent me a letter claiming the HOA had regulatory authority over all common lakefront structures and demanding I vacate until the board reviewed my status. That was when I called my attorney Jonah Bell, a land use lawyer in Gainesville who had known my father, and I read him the letters over the phone. He got quiet in that way. Lawyers get quiet when they are either bored or delighted, and after about 15 seconds he said, "Caleb, send me your grandfather's lease." Not the deed, the lease. I want the whole thing, especially the retained rights section. I scanned everything that night. The deed, the lease, the surveys, the tax records. Even the old hand-drawn map Elias kept folded in wax paper. Jonah called me the next morning before I had finished my coffee. His first words were, "You need to sit down." I said, "That bad?" He said, "No, that good." Then he told me the sentence that changed the whole shape of my life. "Caleb, your grandfather did not just keep the cabin. He kept the land under their roads, their lakefront, their trails, and the dirt beneath every house in Cedar Hollow. They are not your regulators. Technically speaking, they are your tenants." Now, when a lawyer tells you 60 families are technically your tenants, you do not exactly know what to do with that information at first. I just sat there with my coffee getting cold, staring out at Willow Glass Lake, thinking about all those houses up the hill, the porch lights, the kids riding bikes, the retired couples walking dogs, the people who probably had no idea their HOA president was trying to pick a fight with the man whose grandfather had leased them the ground beneath their lives. It would have been easy to get mean right then. I had every reason. Marla had called the cops on me, lied to dispatch, sent fines, hired a lawyer, and treated me like some drifter who wandered out of the woods with a mattress and a dream. But the strange thing about inheriting land from a man like Elias Whitmore is that you also inherit his restraint, or at least you try to. My grandfather used to say, "Never swing because somebody insulted you. Swing because the facts are finally standing in the right place." So instead of posting online, instead of marching up to Marla's house, instead of taping the deed to the clubhouse door like a crazy man in a revenge movie, I started collecting facts. Jonah told me to pull every county record connected to the parcel. So the next morning I drove to the Gilmer County Deeds office and spent half a day with a clerk named Miss Lorna, who had blue reading glasses, a coffee mug that said, "Ask me about public records," and the kind of patience that makes democracy possible. She led me to a file cabinet that looked old enough to have known my grandfather personally, and by lunchtime I had the original 1966 deed, the 1986 ground lease, 3 boundary surveys, every recorded easement, the tax payment history, and an amended plat showing exactly where Cedar Hollow began and where it absolutely did not. The lease was the kind of document my grandfather loved, plain, stubborn, and impossible to misunderstand if you actually read it. It said the developer leased 28 acres for residential construction, but Elias retained all rights to the larger parcel, including lakefront access, roads, utility corridors, trail crossings, timber, water frontage, and oversight of any structure placed outside the leased boundary. There was even a clause saying the association could not alter, improve, restrict, or claim any portion of the retained land without written permission from the lessor. That lessor used to be Elias, then my father, and now me. I remember sitting in my truck outside the courthouse with those certified copies on the passenger seat, feeling something cold and steady settle into me. Marla was not just wrong. She was loud wrong, official wrong, letterhead wrong, lawyer wrong, Facebook wrong in advance. And sure enough, Facebook came next. Cedar Hollow had a private group with more than 200 people in it, and I was not in it because I value my blood pressure. But an older resident named June Pritchard started sending me screenshots. June had lived there since 1991, back when the clubhouse was still a construction trailer with a coffee pot, and she had known my grandfather well enough to know he was not some ghost story Marla could rewrite. The first post showed my cabin from the trail, zoomed in at the ugliest angle possible, with my firewood stack in the foreground like a criminal exhibit. Marla wrote, "This abandoned lakefront structure is now occupied without approval and may threaten property values." Another post called me a squatter. A third said the board was investigating public safety concerns. Public safety, by the way, was apparently my old tin roof, my pickup truck, and one kayak leaning against the porch like it had committed mail fraud. The comments were exactly what you think they were. People who had never met me were calling me unstable, illegal, dangerous. One guy said the sheriff should have removed me the first day, and a woman named Brenda suggested a volunteer cleanup day to handle the eyesore, which is neighborhood code for bring gloves and pretend trespassing as charity. I wanted to answer. I really did. I had a whole speech ready in my head, something sharp and righteous and probably not helpful. But Jonas said, "Let her talk. Every post is a time-stamped gift." So I let her talk. Then Marla filed her first county complaint. She told code enforcement the cabin was unsafe, unpermitted, possibly contaminated, and that the dock was a hazard to children. Which was interesting because no children were allowed on my dock unless they crossed my land to get there. A county inspector named Mr. Dawes came out on a Thursday morning, a quiet man with a clipboard and boots that had seen real mud, not HOA mud. I showed him the septic records, the well test, the electrical inspection my father had paid for years earlier, and then I walked him through the cabin. He tapped beams, checked the foundation, looked at the fireplace, stepped out on the dock, bounced once on the boards and said, "Mr. Poor, Whitmore, I have seen lake houses worth 7 figures held together with spray foam and optimism, and this is not one of them." His report found no violations. Marla filed another complaint the next week, then another after that. Light pollution, erosion, illegal storage, unauthorized trail obstruction, wildlife feeding, which I assume referred to the crime of existing near squirrels. Jonah had me request the records. In 18 months, Horner had filed 9 complaints connected to my property, and every single one had been closed with no violation found. That was when I stopped thinking of her as mistaken. Mistaken people correct themselves when the facts arrive. Marla was not mistaken. Marla was protecting something. I learned what it was from June and another homeowner, a retired electrician named Frank Mercer, who came down to the cabin one evening with a peach pie his wife had baked and a folder full of HOA newsletters. Frank was the kind of man who did not gossip until he had receipts, which made him my kind of man. He told me Marla had built her whole reputation on lake access. She had campaigned for board president promising to beautify the waterfront, increase property values, and make Cedar Hollow feel exclusive again, which was a funny word to use for land her association did not own. The year before I moved in, she had pushed through a special assessment, $11,500 total, for lakefront improvements. Signs, gravel, a viewing deck, trail railings, little cedar benches with inspirational sayings burned into them. I had seen some of it from the access road but assumed it was inside the leased area. It was not. Frank spread the newsletter on my kitchen table and pointed at a photo of Marla cutting a ribbon on a wooden overlook built on my ridge. There she was, smiling with oversized scissors, standing on land my grandfather had never leased, using homeowner money to celebrate a trespass. I laughed when I saw it. Not because it was funny exactly, but because sometimes the human body reaches for laughter when anger would make too much sense. Jonah did not laugh when I sent him the photos. He sent the HOA and Marla a 16-page cease and desist letter that read less like a threat and more like a weather report for a storm already overhead. It included the deed, the lease, the boundary plat, the county inspection reports, the closed complaints, screenshots of the posts, and a polite but very clear explanation that Cedar Hollow had no authority over my cabin, no ownership of the lakefront, no right to regulate my access road, and no permission to build anything on the retained Whitmore land. The letter also demanded they remove the unauthorized structures or negotiate a legal access agreement. Marla responded the way people respond when they have mistaken control for intelligence. She posted that I was attempting a hostile takeover of Cedar Hollow. She said my documents were misleading. She said the board's legal counsel had confirmed the association's rights through long-standing community use, which is a phrase people use when they do not have a deed. Then she announced to protect our lake rally for Saturday morning. The rally was held at the gravel turnout near my access road, which, because God has a sense of humor, was also on my land. I watched from the porch with Frank and June beside me, drinking coffee while about 35 people gathered with handmade signs and matching green shirts. Marla stood on a little folding step stool with a bullhorn and talked about outside interests, land grabs, neighborhood heritage, and the importance of standing together. Frank leaned over and whispered, "She is trespassing to accuse you of stealing your own dirt." I nearly choked on my coffee, but under the absurdity, something sad was happening. Most of those people were not evil. I was scared. They had bought homes, paid dues, trusted a board, and believed the lake belonged to them because somebody with a badge and a lanyard kept saying it did. That was the part that kept me up that night. Marla had made me the villain because she needed the homeowners frightened enough not to ask questions. So I gave them answers. I wrote a letter. Not angry, not cute, not full of legal fireworks. I told them who I was, who Elias was, how the lease worked, what land was leased, and what land was retained. I told them I had no desire to disrupt their homes, their access, or their peace. I told them my grandfather believed neighbors should share a lake before they fought over one. But I also told them their HOA president had filed false complaints, called 911 on me, fined property she had no authority over, and spent their assessment money building improvements on land Cedar Hollow did not own. I included a one-page lease summary, a copy of the plat, the clean inspection report, and a photograph of Elias sitting on the cabin steps in 1982 with a stringer of trout and that crooked grin he always had when he knew something nobody else did. I mailed 60 letters, certified. 3 days later, Marla filed an emergency petition in Superior Court accusing me of harassment, intimidation, and interference with HOA governance. Her lawyer, Preston Hale, claimed my ownership was disputed. My letters were designed to frighten residents, and my presence at the cabin was a nuisance to the community. Jonah called me after reading it and said, "Well," she finally gave us a courtroom. The hearing was set for Monday morning. That Sunday night, I sat on the porch while the lake went black and the insects started their summer noise, and I remember looking at my grandfather's rocking chair beside me, thinking how strange it was that a man could spend his whole life doing things carefully, quietly, correctly, and decades later those quiet choices could rise up like a wall. I was nervous. I will not pretend otherwise. Courtrooms make truth feel less certain until somebody official says it out loud. But I also knew this much. Marla had built her little kingdom on assumptions. And Monday morning, Jonah and I were going to walk in with the deed. Monday morning, Jonah and I walked into the Gilmer County Courthouse with one banker's box, 2 rolled maps, and the kind of quiet confidence you only get when the other side has spent months making noise instead of reading. Marla was already there, sitting beside Preston Hale in the cream-colored suit, pearls shining, chin lifted, looking less like a defendant in her own bad judgment and more like a woman waiting for someone to thank her for protecting civilization. The judge, Eleanor Briggs, was not that someone. She listened while Preston argued that my letters had frightened the residents, that my claim to the land was disruptive, that Cedar Hollow had always treated the lakefront as community property, and that my presence had created confusion and distress. Then Jonah stood up, slow, almost gentle. and started laying paper on the table. First the 1966 deed, then the 1986 ground lease, then the tax records, then the county plat, then the inspection reports, then the 9 complaints Marla had filed, everyone closed with no violation, then the 911 call summary where Marla had described me as possibly armed while I was carrying furniture. Judge Briggs read longer than anyone expected. The room got so quiet I could hear Marla clicking the cap of her pen. Finally, the judge looked at Preston and asked, "Did you perform a title search before filing this petition?" Preston cleared his throat and said, "Your Honor, the association relied on its historical understanding of the property." Judge Briggs stared at him over her glasses and said, "That was not my question. Did you perform a title search?" "No, Your Honor, not a full one." She closed the folder. "Then I suggest your client develop a new historical understanding." The petition is denied. Mr. Whitmore has presented recorded ownership, a valid lease, and evidence that the association has no jurisdiction over his cabin or the retained land. She turned to Marla and added, "Madam President, community authority is not created by repetition. You may not say a thing belongs to you until people get tired enough to believe it." Marla went pale, not embarrassed pale, but the kind of pale you see right before pride starts looking for a weapon. That ruling should have ended it. It did not. 2 weeks later, Marla hired a bigger attorney from Atlanta, a woman named Vivian Cross, who sent Jonah a 22-page letter arguing that Cedar Hollow had acquired rights through long-standing use, neighborhood reliance, and constructive abandonment, which sounded impressive until Jonah explained it in plain English. "They are saying your grandfather let them use parts of the land so long that they now own the right to use them." I asked him if that could work. He said, "Not while they have been paying rent for 38 years. Rent is an admission. You do not get to pay a landlord on Friday and claim you own his dirt on Monday." Jonas sent a response with a lease payment history, every quarterly check from the association to Elias, then my father, then me. The line that did the most damage was simple. Cedar Hollow cannot claim hostile use of land while making voluntary lease payments to the landowner. The tenancy defeats the claim. Vivian went quiet. Marla did not. At an emergency board meeting, she pushed through a resolution suspending all lease payments to the Whitmore estate until ownership was resolved. One board member, a retired accountant named Nolan Greer, voted no and apparently said, on the record, "This is the most expensive tantrum I have ever witnessed." He was right. The lease had a default clause, 30 days to cure missed payment, or the lessor could terminate. Jonah sent the notice. Within 24 hours, my phone had so many missed calls it looked like I had become a weather emergency. Homeowners who had ignored my first letter were suddenly reading everything. They pulled county records. They read the lease. They found the plat, the Facebook group, the same one that had called me a squatter, turned on Marla like a flock of birds changing direction all at once. Who authorized this? Why were payments stopped? Do we own our lots or not? Did the board spend our assessment on land we do not own? Marla tried deleting comments, then locking threads, then posting a statement about misinformation and legal strategy, which only made everybody more furious because nothing calms scared homeowners like the phrase legal strategy from the person who lit the match. Nolan Greer called a community meeting of the Cedar Hollow Clubhouse the following Saturday and invited me to speak. I almost said no. A part of me was tired in a way. Sleep does not fix. But then I thought about my grandfather, about how many times Elias must have stood on the boundary line with angry men on both sides, holding a map and letting the truth do the heavy lifting. So I went. The clubhouse was packed shoulder to shoulder. 60 homeowners, spouses, adult kids, 3 board members. Marla in the front row with the Vivian Cross beside her, and June sitting near the aisle giving me a tiny nod like she was lending me her backbone. Jonas set up the projector. I stood there with my palms damp and my throat dry. And for 1 second I saw myself the way they probably saw me. Not as a neighbor, not as a villain, just a man standing between them and the comfort of what they thought they owned. So I started with Elias. I put his photo on the screen. Him sitting on the cabin steps in an old Braves cap, holding a trout and smiling like the world had not yet learned how to rush him. I told them he leased land because he wanted families on the lake, not because he wanted power over them. Then I showed the deed, the lease, the payment ledger, the plat map, with the leased Cedar Hollow parcel in yellow and the retained Whitmore land in blue, wrapping around the roads, the ridge, the lakefront, the turnout, the trails. The room went still. Then I showed the complaints, the inspection reports clearing them, the unauthorized viewing deck, the special assessment newsletter, and finally, the board resolution Marla had signed suspending rent. I said, "Your president stopped payment on the land beneath your homes without asking you, without explaining the default cause, and without telling you that 38 years of rent checks are the reason her legal argument collapses." For 4 seconds, nobody moved. Then a man in the third row stood up and said, "Marla, is that true?" Marla stood too, gripping her folder. The board acted on advice. He asked again, "Did you stop the payments?" She said yes, but the legal situation is complex. That word complex broke something open. People started shouting from every corner. A woman yelled that her husband had just refinanced. Another demanded to know where the assessment money went. Frank Mercer stood and said, "You called this man a squatter while cashing checks to his family." June, sweet June, raised one hand and said, "Marla, honey, I've seen raccoons in my trash with a stronger legal position than yours." That got the only laugh of the night, and it was not a kind one. Marla looked at the room, then at me, then at the side door. She left without another word. 3 board members followed. Nolan Greer stayed. By the end of the meeting, the homeowners voted to remove Marla from the board, cure the lease default immediately, repay interest, audit the special assessment, and open negotiations with me for a formal access agreement. The fallout took months. Marla was charged with filing a false police report and took a plea, a fine, probation, and the kind of public shame no pearl necklace can dress up. The HOA's insurer settled my civil claims for trespass, harassment, and property damage. The viewing deck came down, the signs came down, the gravel path was restored. Some homeowners apologized in person. Some avoided eye contact for a year. Both reactions felt human enough. Eventually, the new board and I signed a new long-term lease with clear boundaries, updated rent, shared road maintenance, insurance coverage, and a designated lake access area for residents. It was fair, which is all I had wanted before Marla turned neighborliness into a courtroom sport. I still live in the cabin. I replaced the rusted porch screens last fall, patched the tin roof, and put my grandfather's rocking chair by the front window where it catches the evening light. Sometimes I hear kids laughing down by the approved shoreline, paddles knocking against kayaks, fathers pretending they know how to untangle fishing line, mothers calling everybody back before dark. Those sounds do not bother me. They're the sounds Elias probably imagined when he signed that lease. People sharing a place without trying to own every inch of it. What stays with me is not the court order, or the money, or even Marla walking out of that clubhouse. It is the first day, when she could have walked down the gravel road, knocked on my door and asked who I was. Instead, she called 911. And maybe that is the real lesson. The worst people in a neighborhood are not always the ones breaking the rules. Sometimes they are the ones making up rules, printing them on letterhead, and hoping nobody asks to see the deed. So tell me in the comments who was right here, the man protecting his grandfather's land, or the homeowners who believe the community they paid into should have protected them from this mess in the first place. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA that confused a clipboard with actual authority, subscribe, because the next story is about a board that built a private gate across a public road, and the farmer who removed it with a tractor before breakfast.